Hey Tim,
Hey man, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Um, Decided to shift my attention over to some philosophy. Working on I was asked to do an external review of a graduate program at another university,
Hmm.
which I do have a compartment of my brain that can do that sort of stuff. But it's not fun. Um,
Yeah, no,
but
I understand.
professionally necessary, valuable. But yeah, there's a lot of dysfunction in higher ed over here.
Not just over there, without getting into it in too much detail. Uh, and a lot of administrative burden that falls on academics these days who are not, don't necessarily have the proclivities for such tasks, not the most efficient administrators and etc.
Yeah, it seems like there are always new administrators being hired and still always more things that administrative things for faculty to do. So I don't know. Seems inefficient. But to talk about efficiency makes me sound like I'm ready to sign up for Musk's Department of Government Efficiency or whatever, which
Mm,
is seems likely that one of the first things they're going to go after is the Department of Education, and so that's going to bring big changes
mm. That's very
to
concerning.
everything from kindergarten through high school, but also for universities in terms of student loans and defunding institutions going out. He wants to go after the endowments of the big Ivy Leagues if they can find if the Justice Department can find evidence of inappropriate what they deem to be inappropriate admissions decisions around affirmative action and that sort of thing,
Mm.
which the Supreme Court recently decided to not allow, then they're going to try to you know dip into Harvard's endowment with a big fine or something, and so yeah, it's going to get nasty.
It sounds nasty. It sounds very concerning. But who needs education anyway? You just interpolate us into some symbolic order that mediates our, expression as consumers, expressed by consuming, and that's
Mm, yeah,
function fulfilled.
right. Yeah. Um, right. AI could do all of this anyways.
Mm.
But let's not be technological determinists. I feel that Felix Guattari has opened up alternative futures that were not destined to be enframed um, by technology, as Heidegger would have it. But there might be other trajectories if we can liberate our desires from the canalizations of consumer capitalism, for one. Um, Although capitalism can also function in deterritorializing ways at the same time. It's not just a mechanism for capturing us, but decodes our desires and then finds new ways of addicting us to uh, pleasure and status and such.
Yeah, so we can proliferate reference frames, we can proliferate universes of reference, but this is to some degree what capitalism does,
Mhm.
as this sort of heterogenetic process. And yeah, always finding new ways to capture us, always installing new attractors, new abstract machines. Uh, yeah, I mean, this is obviously a great concern. The way the logic of capitalism appears to quite readily imitate, let's just the logic of heterogenetic evolution. And part of this is deeply embedded in the DNA, to abuse a metaphor, but of evolutionary thought itself, obviously, and there's a long and close association on the theoretical side between evolution and economics. And not to mention, when we think of the concept of ecology, that was introduced by Ernst Haeckel, right? But Darwin had the equivalent, but it was the economy of nature, right? So
Mhm.
these thought forms are deeply intertwined. Um, the economy is a management, oikos nomos. I mean, getting into the etymology, it can be fun. There are going to be different ways to translate nomos, as there are going to be different ways to translate the logos in oikos logos. But if we think of nomos as management, which it's often translated as in terms of its etymological role in the term economy, the economy is a management of the ecology of the relations of human subjects, and obviously more than human subjects, a mediation of the relationship between the human world and the rest of the world, in which the human world is embedded, is ontologically very much part of, emergent from, but nonetheless has its own, distinct mode of operation. And the economy all too expansively encompasses so much of the human world, right? And that's what we want to break out of in many ways. So that's the hyper retractor, you know,
Right.
catabolism, the catabolic metabolism of capital. No. But there's this proliferation of attractors within the capitalist machine, but the hyper attractor of, let's say, economic reality, that none of those, like, we're always being the proliferation is always occurring within that broader frame of reference. And we're always, you seem to be finding a line of flight, which is an escape, but then you're being redirected back towards that hyper attractor, co-opted back into that machine. And of course,
Right.
there are lots of really lovely examples, and hopefully we can get into some of this when we dig into the guts of this chapter, machinic heterogenesis by Guattari. There are tons of really fascinating examples of these analogous processes happening in non-human nature. But the question really is, I think a pressing question for Guattari would be, how could we mobilize an understanding of these machinic processes of heterogenesis as they are operative in all these different domains of the real, to actually escape what he would call in the book Three Ecologies, integrated world capitalism. And I don't
Mhm.
think he clearly didn't have, he had lots of responses to that, but I don't think he had the answers, right? Because here we are, and he's been dead for 30 years or whatever. So uh,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of my favorite examples, which is a memory of mine that is quite important, from when I was, I think, 18, and going to a movie in a mall, and was just starting to get exposed to some anarchist and socialist political thought. And there's a store, I don't know if it was called Pax Sun or one of these, stores appealing to teenage styles. And they're selling Che Guevara t-shirts, for like $30. And it just, the contradictions of that really struck me. And I remember feeling all of a sudden like I was in a prison. The mall became a prison, that, and I saw how easily capitalism can capture what otherwise might be radical political movements to subvert the capitalist order. And this was just prior to like Facebook and social media really taking off. And I think what's really accelerated this process of capture is how so much activism has moved into social media spaces where you've got
Mm.
these really, and I'm not dismissing this work as totally worthless, but you're on Instagram as a radical leftist of whatever sort, pushing your critiques and feeding the ad revenue of these big corporations and hooking people to these algorithms, and I just don't think it's very effective actually. So much energy gets used in that area, wasted really. And so our desire just gets so easily recaptured despite, like the form of it gets recaptured and just furthers capitalism, even if the content appears anti-capitalist. And it's
Yeah,
quite demoralizing to think about.
I suppose that the hope is that through these platforms provided by capitalism, capitalism comes to eat itself in a certain way, and that's part of the one aspect of the accelerationist, you know, vision, I suppose. I hear what you're saying. I wonder what alternatives there are, because how would one achieve the kind of scale that, and maybe that's again the carrot, that's the bait in a way, is that you can readily achieve a certain kind of reach, a certain, you can build a platform which reaches a certain number of people readily, relatively easily through these platforms, and thus that is part of that process of recapturing you. But again, I don't really know. I mean, I don't feel like I'm a particularly astute political thinker or commentator, so I don't know what the answer is to that at
But
all.
I mean, part of what seems to be going on here, for Guattari and Deleuze, his frequent co-author, and I told you I was dipping back into Anti-Oedipus,
Mm-hmm.
is they're deeply appreciative of Marx and Freud and Lacan, but trying to go beyond them and emphasizing the sense in which Marx's astuteness and critical prowess in investigating the material conditions of capitalism and of the capitalist economy, um, misses the libidinal economy, uh, right? And the ways that, obviously the communist revolution didn't happen, the workers didn't gain this consciousness that Marx assumed they would, because there's a way in which, as desiring machines, right, our libido can be uh, captured, distracted, redirected, by marketing, by very skilled advertisers and PR firms. And, they were writing before they had television and they saw the internet coming. But I think social media just dramatically amplifies these issues of like libidinal capture. And you ask, what are the alternatives? I mean, that's the whole problem, is like, um, social media has so effectively both isolated us and prevented the kind of, you know, real material organization, like creating alternative economies. I mean, people do that work, but I feel like social media gives us the opportunity at the level of meaning divorced from materiality to feel like we're one of the good ones, or we're moral, or we believe the right thing. At the same time that it increasingly uh, makes us powerless to bring about those changes, because we're not meeting with the people, our neighbors, to organize against rents going up, but we're, connecting with people all over the world, which is great. But um, the leverages of power might be closer to home, and, being hooked on these social media networks to express our feelings at a symbolic level could be functioning as a distraction a lot of the time. Um, and so, yeah, adding this understanding of desire to Marx's analysis, but then also, um, not, I guess Guattari studied with Lacan, is that right? And then realize the limitations of Lacan's understanding of desire is simply a lack. And so the productive power of desire seems to be what Guattari and Deleuze are emphasizing with this term desiring machines.
Yeah.
Um,
And that is more Jungian, just to sort of reference
mhm,
some of the chats that we've had in the past, where there's a more generalized notion of the libido as well. The libido isn't purely sexual, but is, a drive more generally that can be invested in all sorts of different things and is productive of things. The unconscious for Jung is not just, the storehouse of those things that we've repressed, don't want to engage with, or just the things that we've experienced during the course of the day and then forgotten, but is actually a generative process, and that's very key to this way of thinking. And I think you're absolutely right about the ways their analysis of our desire and the apparatuses of capture that exploit our desire. But the desiring machine is also, and importantly, a liberatory notion, right? Because as desiring machines, subjects are not always already pre-canalized or pre-captured by the symbolic order. So that's the key limitation that they see with the Lacanian. And I mean, Guattari goes into this in this chapter, machinic heterogenesis, a little bit. The subject for Freud, the Oedipalized subject, and then the Lacanian development of the structuralist, structural linguistic psychoanalysis on the Freudian model. The image there is of a subject that, from a very early age, right, from infancy, is Oedipalized, is interpolated into a symbolic order in this, relatively fixed relational position. Initially like mummy, daddy, me. But then is kind of defined and constituted. So Lacan definitely has a socializing aspect to his thought. So the subject is more, socially, collectively constituted, but still sort of within the symbolic order. Identity is within the symbolic order. And so the subject then is cut off from the real, right? And I think that, Guattari, and certainly, one of the reasons that Guattari and Deleuze got together is partly because I think Deleuze was a little bit more into Lacan earlier on. And yes, Guattari was actually studying with him, but always, there's a little microcosm of the kind of Freud-Jung relationship there, like maybe always had his own differences and then kind of broke away. But the notion of the machinic subject, so the desiring machine, as it would become in Anti-Oedipus, is that it's actually at the intersection of machine and structure, but it's and we should get into this term, obviously, machine and what they really mean by that, and it's kind of important to try and understand this notion of both desiring machines, machinic heterogenesis, machinic assemblage, all of this stuff. But the subjects, like desiring subjects, are real processes. They're embedded within the real, and they cut real flows. So they're in direct contact with the real, and the machinism, which we can elaborate on, but that's the act of cutting and kind of reorganizing. But so actually in more Marxist or Engels type terms, like dialectics of nature terms, the subject here is a force of nature that therefore acts on and within nature, is not pre-severed from nature. So yes, the subject then, it might have this aspect which is canalized by, captured by the symbolic order. So maybe that's the discursive identity or like the ego or whatever. But the subject, like Jung's psyche, is much greater than that and includes this generative drive, desire, this power of enunciation, which is genuinely, authentically, and there's certainly a lot of subtweeting of Heidegger in this machinic heterogenesis essay, who is sort of avoided like in direct reference. There's this famous, footnote in Difference and Repetition where Deleuze talks about Heidegger, and some people say that he didn't have any references to Heidegger in there, and then because this was one of his doctoral theses, a supervisor said, "Hey, you really ought to talk about Heidegger because he's super relevant." So Deleuze puts in this big footnote, but otherwise neglects him, and he's not really mentioned, I suppose. Certainly not. I can't really think of in most of the co-authored works, but he's directly mentioned here, and then his terms and framing and various other things are mentioned in here in terms of the role of technology. But yeah, this psyche, this subject as a whole being greater than the symbolic order, and thus able to generate by cutting, by dissolving or deterritorializing any given sort of attractor state, any given abstract machine, in fact, cutting, breaking it apart, opening up lines of flight, and then able to reconstitute a novel attractor, a novel abstract machine, etc. Again, the question is, what kind of escape velocity is required to get out of that hyper attractor of capitalism? But this is the process that's being discussed here. So they feel then that the structure, just to finish, the structural linguistics of Lacan, which they are criticizing, is like it has an already pre-neutered subject. Essentially, the subject is totally canalized and defined, collectively, and thus by the apparatuses of capture of capital and whatever. And they want to see a way out of that through a direct contact with the real.
Um, it seems to me that part of what's going on here is a move away from the conception of the subject or the ego as a sort of stable identity that persists through time, and instead a sense of new subjectivities constantly being produced as a result of relationships, not just with other human beings, but with machinic assemblages, and that this is how I understand this, schizogenesis, is to accept, not it's not a glorification of mental illness, but rather a attempt to look at that as a model for how actually even so-called healthy subjects also have this tendency, or this, the part of our nature, if I could use that word, although it's not an essence, but part of what it is to be human being is to be constantly rediscovering a new form of subjectivity. And so we're freed from that sense of fixed identity to discover ourselves anew in each uh, event, each interaction, each encounter. Um, and I think that's a there's something really quite radical in that, but it's also just an attempt to be more transparent, I guess, about what's always going on. And to uh, they say at the beginning of Anti-Oedipus, that their model is not the patient on the couch, but the schizophrenic on a walk, who's able to sort of transverse boundaries and roles, and rediscover an original relationship, to the world. And not just one, like, oh, now I'm authentic, but again, constantly having to rediscover this. And so it, in one way, is liberating, but in another way, it asks a lot of us
Mm.
to be more comfortable with no solid sense of fixed identity. So it's quite a radical political project, because it goes deeper than just liberating a preformed political subject, but is actually psychologically saying, uh, you never were that subject.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. Yes, and almost kind of trivially true in the sense that I'm a different person, in different contexts. When I'm giving a lecture, when I'm tutoring, when I'm talking to my friends, when I'm out in nature, when I'm with my daughter, when I'm with my parents, all, the alterities, and this is the key point for Guattari in this particular chapter as well. And there's an against autopoiesis argument here that I don't quite want to get to yet, but the alterities that one is always in contact with are subjectivating. So are always, any subject is always involved in a milieu, which and is partially constituted by that relational network. This is a relationism, obviously, right? And that's where we should get to a disambiguation between machinism and the machinic and mechanism and the mechanical, which is anti-relational. But just on your point, like a psychotic on a walk is better, is a more apt model than a neurotic on the couch. There is a whole fascinating history again here of psychoanalysis. And of course, I probably come across as a bit of a Jung boffin, but Jung is the member of that lineage initially who is the analyst of psychotic patients. That's where Jung very much got his start as a clinician, and well before he was came into Freud's orbit. He was with Eugene Bleuler, considered one of the world's leading experts on psychosis, and that's part of what brought him into contact with Freud. And his desire was always to see whether the psychoanalytic methods of Freud, which were developed for work really with neurotic patients, and Freud felt that psychotics were not analyzable, would actually be applicable to the patients that Jung was working with at the Begeholzli. And I mean, we've talked a little bit about this in previous episodes, and Freud coming to visit Jung at the Begeholzli and sort of being completely baffled by the way in which Jung could spend very long periods of time just listening to the ramblings and ravings of psychotic patients, trying to find the particular, I guess, attractors, the particular abstract machine or whatever that was being articulated, the order basically to those ramblings, and Freud just saying, these people are so boring, I don't know how you can do that. And then generation later, or a couple of generations later, you've got Guattari at Laborde, at this sort of experimental institution where they're developing this notion of institutional analysis, which is where the institution itself is kind of implicated, is part of the assemblage with the patients in it, but their roles in the institution. And so they have again, to the point you brought up about having to kind of continually differentiate and reconstitute one's identity or one's role in some collective. They have this method called the grid, where they reorganize periodically people's particular roles, and everyone does a little bit of everything that they're capable of doing. So you've got analysts who are in the kitchen or taking out the trash, and you've got patients who are organizing theatrical reviews and taking on a bunch of responsibility for the administrative running of the institution as well. And so people's roles are being shifted. And just as Jung again says, sometimes if you say a creative person comes to an analytic session, sometimes you just need to tell them to go and create something or whatever. I mean, a bit like that, in the sense that the therapeutic prescription might be to do some kind of embodied activity, but a little bit more radical again. Guattari will talk about how, someone who is an intellectual who spends all their time reading and writing or whatever will be made to or encouraged to go and do a bunch of manual labor for a while. And similarly, people who are from a manual background might be encouraged to do the books or, whatever. So taking people out of their comfort zone. And also he interestingly talks about one of the most important events in his life being learning to drive, but kind of developing a new mode of let's say, of subjectivity, or a new power of expression associated with the acquisition of or the deployment of some novel set of embodied practices or skills or whatever it might be. Like I can become a new person, and thus I can escape the trappings of whatever, you know, pathological state I'm in that's brought me to this institution in the first instance, right? Or the way capitalism, or you know, the power relations, the power structures that I'm, you know, habitually embedded in, feel like they're circumscribing me and you know, capturing me and canalizing me. By engaging in something else, by getting outside my comfort zone, by just doing something different, I can become a new person. And that was very, as I say, that's very deeply embedded in the therapeutic practice that Guattari was developing at Laborde. So it's
Yeah.
really fascinating. One of the things that's really fascinating about Guattari, I think, and again, people like Jung and of course Lacan and others as well, but is the way that their theory and their, like, he's not quote unquote just a philosopher. You know, he's actually spending, I mean, he was also very much an activist, a radical political activist as well, and involved in all these different groups. And this is something Deleuze couldn't quite understand as well in their relationship. He's like, I don't know how Felix has all this energy for all these different groups that he's involved, and then he's at like Laborde with the patients for 10 hours a day and blah blah blah, and in the evening I'm forcing him to write. You know, there's all this fascinating anecdotes to talk about there, but very much not just the academic in the ivory tower or whatever, you know, very deeply involved in a praxis which was about improving the lives of suffering people, but on the political front, on the clinical front, and then also he's got this theoretical outpouring at the same time, and that's what makes him an interesting figure, I think.
Hmm. Would you agree that there's a relationship here to, in terms of the um, multiplication of subjects, the multiplicity of subjectivities, and his desire to break free of structuralism by leaning on Peirce, and you know he mentions Peirce here on diagrams, but you know in Peirce's triadic semiotics, you've got this not only the three-way relationship that breaks you out of the binary of signs just pointing to other signs, you having the object, the sign, and the interpretant, but in some sense, just as Whitehead would say, no subject thinks twice. From Peirce's perspective, we could say no interpretant interprets twice because the interpretant in one moment of interpretation becomes the sign for the next interpretant, right? And so there's a process of ongoing genesis of new points of view, new subjectivities as a result of shifting to this triadic form of semiosis, out of the binary form of semiosis, where, as Guattari puts it on page 44, he says um, this frees us from an identity locked into simple structural relations, um, allows us to deploy diverse registers of alterity. And so do you think that this is part of how Guattari is able to think um, this process of a sort of multiplicity of me and the multiple subjectivities because he's leaning on a Peircean form of semiosis instead of Saussure's binary semiosis?
I think that's for sure part of it. And of course, Peirce has these notions of the dynamic interpretant, and like, you know, change and process are fully Peirce attempts, you know, Peirce has this very heavy logical system, and a bit like Whitehead, right? But both of them are attempting to you know, make that as dynamic as possible, and that's very much what Guattari is exercised by. And again, we should go back to the beginning here in a second with machine and his essay Machine and Structure, and just to tease out this notion of the machine and what he's getting at there, and how it relates to structure, how it relates to the breaking out of structuralism. So the post-structuralist, let's say, aspect to the thought here. But no, I think that you're very right. And of course, you know, Peirce in discovering and elaborating all of the nuances of sign use. He does have this triadic scheme, but it ends up with like 66 different sign types, right? Because of all the ways these different categories layer. And so he's trying to capture the complexity of sign usage through a proliferating,
But it's like the process of semiosis becomes internal to subjectivity in the sense that in order to maintain a coherent, relatively coherent sense of identity, I have to interpret myself. My present self must interpret my past self to my future self, constantly. And so selfhood or our the sense of there being a stream of consciousness that's more or less continuous is a task. It's not just a given, and it's a process of communication and self-interpretation that's
yeah.
constantly being broken open by, the assemblages that we become part of.
Yes, and Peirce also, similarly to Guattari, was not something Guattari is necessarily getting from Peirce, but finding something of a fellow traveler there, has a notion of the kind of bare particularity, the sort of auto-iconic nature of signs in the way they relate to themselves, and are irreducibly themselves. Peirce also, his triadic scheme, as we've discussed in other talks, extends to the triune real, which I think of as an aspectualism. So any given thing, we can take a different stance towards it. It can be revealed in the mode of firstness, in the mode of secondness, in the mode of thirdness. So everything is kind of polymorphous, in itself, depending on how we are choosing to relate to it. And then a really big thing for Guattari, and I don't know how much people have tried to plug Guattari or Deleuze and Guattari. I'm sure for the latter, there will have been some work on this, but into a kind of biosemiotic framework, because the notion of the a-signifying semiosis. So again, this is going to bring us to this notion of machinic elements and machinic effects, but the way an object, an element of any kind, can have a certain power of enunciation, a certain effect in the world that is not mediated through a linguistic structural, order. So it's not about its meaning. So it's a-signifying in this sense. A-signifying semiosis kind of sounds, like a contradiction in terms, obviously. And of course, for Peirce, everything is signifying in some sense, right? But I think Guattari very specifically means a-signifying in the sense that the kind of linguistic structuralism of Saussure and into Lacan is signifying within the symbolic order, within the structure of that symbolic order in which the value of signs is determined. And again, Guattari very much retains that, because structuralism has a strongly relational aspect to it, but he wants to dynamize that, make that dynamic. And this is again what the machine is all about for him. It's about how the machine, unlike the structure of structuralism, is open to time on all sides. So it's a very temporal notion, and it goes into a structural order, into a particular reference frame, into a particular context, and it has cutting edges, right? It goes in there and it like unzips and cuts relations so that novel relations can be reconstituted. So instead of having this kind of transcendent symbolic order of signification that is always pre-canalizing, or that has predetermined the possibilities of expression, you've got these things, these alterities, basically, that these machinic elements that are coming in from outside and just disorganizing, reorganizing, deterritorializing, obviously, and affording the possibility of the constitution of a novel order. But they are in themselves, let's say, in relation to the as alterities, in relation to the order of signification that they are entering in as alterities, they are asignifying in relation to that.
Mhm.
because they're not pre-canalized by it. They don't have a place in its symbolic order,
Right.
but they break that order and enable, and then they could become, in a sense, canalized in a novel symbolic order. And of course, I want to get into the way I will analogize that with exogenous chemistry and what it does.
Mhm.
And we were speaking about co-option and capture before, and the little elephant in the room there for our conversations, obviously, is the co-option of disruptive pharmacology, psychedelics, etc., by capital, and that's something maybe we can return to towards the end. But,
Yeah. So his concept of the machinic or these machinic assemblages seems I like there's like a mercurial quality in the sense that the machinic is constantly trespassing, transgressing boundaries, and um, the symbolic order seems to create a kind of social solipsism in the sense that the human cannot is trapped in that social enclosure and is severed from nature in a way, whereas the way that Guattari is discussing the machine as a sort of in between process of production that always is transversal. It moves across this boundary between nature and society, or between the semiotic and or the symbolic and the material, and forces us to recognize that those boundaries are not fixed and not solid. Um, and I
and
think
not ontological.
not
Uh,
ontological, right? They're internal to a particular symbolic order, um, that's culturally specific. I mean, he goes into a particular African tribe's fetish around like a heap of sand, I think it was.
the
And
leg bar in the fawn, right? Um,
right. And he's explicit about the ways that these sorts of archaic societies or indigenous peoples are better equipped than white male capitalistic subjectivities to understand the sort of mapping that across these levels that he's trying to describe. Um, which I think there's a lot more work that's been done on that.
yeah.
Like ethnomathematics comes to mind. Just reading a cool paper about that. Um,
I
where
think just the ontological turn in anthropology, like
yeah,
I think Deleuze and Guattari are, you know,
they
discuss anthropology a great deal, so they're very
yeah.
influenced by the anthropology of earlier generations, but then they have themselves also been quite influential on the development of the subsequent anthropology and the ontological turn and the proliferation of perspectives and all of that. But sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, there's a great book by I think he's an anthropologist, Eduardo Cohn,
Oh,
um, How Forests Think.
Oh yeah, yeah. I have that somewhere on my desk here. Yeah.
That uses biosemiotics and Peirce's account of semiosis to really break down any sort of divide. There it is, between
Very
society
good.
and nature, um, along these lines. And it's interesting. I love the way that after he discusses the legba, um, this handful of sand that's used in various ways, deeply meaningful ways in this African tribe, that he then points to parallels in modern Western societies that similarly function as sort of like fetish objects, like capital,
Mm.
energy, information, the signifier. Um, that yeah, as you've already hinted at, would as he puts it, would have us believe in the ontological homogeneity that's being referred to with terms like this. And I find this happening all the time when our politicians talk about the economy, which becomes this big abstraction that is supposed to function in this or that way, and it's considered as separate from the environment, which of course we want to conserve, we want to keep it clean and not polluted, and but that whole mode of thinking about uh, the economy as separate from the environment. I think these are kind of like fetish objects that
Yeah.
perform such important social functions in a capitalist society, but that um, have totally blinded us to the actual flows of, um, concrete energy and information through
And
these
also
systems.
the economy as opposed to an
Right.
economy. So the projection of this universal, all encompassing. And so the language itself is the language of homogenizing, hyper attractor capture, right?
Mhm.
If you want to be, if you want to participate in, you know, economic realities, you are always already, according to that worldview, and perhaps that's what some people want you to believe, right? You are always already participating in the economy, not this local economy
Right.
that you know. There's no such thing as a local economy. There's just a global economy, according to that rhetoric. But should we I mean, you should respond, but should we go back and just detail a little bit of the definition of the machine here and
Yeah.
disambiguate it from the mechanical? But if you were going to respond on the economy, do that first. Yeah.
Well, just to say, even in those instances when the global economy breaks down, and like during COVID, we had supply chains started to break down and the shipping of products and, the just-in-time delivery and all these things we became, they were no longer transparent. We became aware of how fragile the system is. But even in that um, manifestation of the heterogeneity that underlies the term the economy, it's still just further entrenched this view of, oh, well, everything's connected, so it is one big economy, instead of recognizing that, oh, there's so many layers of different things going on here. Um,
And also to the extent that it's disconnected under the pressure of this pandemic, it's fragmented, and this is a bad thing, and we need to scramble towards, you know, a maximal reunification. um,
right. Yeah. And just how literal there's like capitalism has so little tolerance for alternative forms of economy. Um, it's like it becomes a national security threat to the United States if, somebody tries to do it differently.
no,
Um,
yeah, there's such a, I mean, there's a history that many people far more knowledgeable than I am have rehearsed a lot there, but it is a truly horrifying history, the history of modern capitalism, and the violence, obviously, that is committed in the name of the holy dollar, right? But in the name of the market, the economy.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it's really horrendous.
Yeah. And it used to be that much of that violence was done at the periphery of the industrial centers, but increasingly the violence is coming home, which destabilizes things and, more so than ever before. But I think we're also captured in ever more ingenious ways by algorithms and social media and whatnot. And so,
Yeah.
um, as the avenues for social and political and ecological transformation open, there are also always more powerful means of curtailing the exit strategies. So, but yeah, I
Yeah.
think we should define some basic terms here, and then get into maybe the autopoiesis discussion. I thought that was really rich, and I can see going back to our first times discussing autopoiesis and your issues with organizational closure that this was an influential essay for you there. I'm sure there are other factors, but
Yeah. It's interesting because I'd read this a long time ago, and then I'd read the whole book again relatively recently, like this year. And we had in the intervening period, we'd had those conversations, and I was like, oh yeah. I think I tweeted about it. I was like, I completely forgot how astute Guattari. So you know, it's one of those things with influence. It's always hard to know. I mean, I tend to think of that issue that I have with autopoiesis, for me, coming more from my background in toxinology in a sense, right?
Right.
And chemical ecology. But why I've been drawn to this text is partly to do this analogical mapping between what he's saying and that chemical ecological world. So yeah, no doubt it was influential on me. I tend to read things and then forget them, and then it's often like, whoa. Anyway, but so yeah, the machine, like it's so just a few things that I try and run through really quickly. Because at the beginning he talks about of this essay, he'll talk about how the machine is a prerequisite for technology rather than its expression. So just pointing out that it's not technology that produces machines, and so the technical machine, and there's a lot of Simondon that we've talked about previously lurking in the background here as well. But so the technical machine, or the machine sensu stricto, or the way that term is typically used, is very much not, is a kind of machine, but is not what's being referred to here by the term machine. It's prior, so the machinic is prior indeed to human techne, and it's a transcendental condition of the possibility of the latter, right? So it's kind of that nature is machinic that affords the possibility of us developing machines.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a few little points that he makes, Aristotle thinking that the goal of techne was to create what nature found impossible to accomplish. Guattari doesn't really go into this, but it's interesting to me how actually it's so often the opposite. So often we are in the technological realm trying to replicate something that nature has long since kind of perfected, at least within its domain of application. And also the way in which so much of our technological developments are predicated on this history of the development of, like, functional traits, artifacts, or whatever, within nature. And I of course think of pharmacology here. Like, we just wouldn't know anything about bioactive molecules unless nature had done most of the work for us. And we are very much, of course, we're designing novel molecules. We're bringing into existence things that nature did not, for our very specific purposes, but we would not be able to do any of that. We're like tinkering on the surface of all this work that nature has done for us. So I think, to the extent that that's a reasonable characterization of Aristotle's view of techne, it's a very insufficient view. And another thing he mentions about techne, just in passing, techne interposes a kind of creative mediation between nature and humanity. So again, there's a lot we could say there, but we can think of niche construction then. The construction of mediators between us and some factor of our environment. Because remember, all of these things are going on within nature. So you talk about a creative mediation between nature and humanity. You're really talking about a mediation between a particular organism and other aspects of its environment that it finds challenging or whatever, it needs to bring under control. And of course, all organisms do that to varying degrees. It's just that, we humans are specialized niche constructors. And then, of course, as we know very well, in the Anthropocene, but maybe better labeled the Capitalocene based on our discussions, not based on our discussions, but in concert with, or in conformity with our discussions, in resonance with them. All organisms are doing this, but as humans are modifying the environment, and I just always look out the window when I say these things, because I'm just looking at this, like, bitumen streets and concrete pathways and sparse trees and all of that, and this incredibly anthropogenic environment. We are creating, of course, novel and often very challenging, but exploitable by particular organisms, ecosystems. And so synanthropic organisms really thrive in these relatively denuded, relatively relatively homogeneous environments that we create for our own sort of comfort. But to get to the meat of the thing, which we need to get to, the disambiguation of machinism, or the machinic, from mechanism and the mechanical. Guattari says, mechanist conceptions of the machine empty it of everything that would enable it to avoid a simple construction, parts, extra parts. So what that means is that in mechanism, we imagine in analogy with the machines that we in fact make. But Simondon has a really great analysis of why, even for even for technical machines, this is not quite right. But we imagine a bunch of pre-existing parts that are assembled into an assemblage, yes, into a machine, into a technical object, that then functions. But in its functioning, all of those parts are atomistic. They remain themselves. We could disassemble it and we would still get exactly those same parts. So it's an anti-relational view mechanism, right? Atomistic parts, yes, they relate in the sense that they bump into each other and there's force transfer and all of that, but they are not constitutively defined by or modified by the relational networks that they enter into. So it's a form of essentializing, atomizing, imagining pre-constituted units that are then constructed into assemblages without mutual modification. And this is the opposite of the machinic, because the machinic is a relational view in which machines at all different levels are not pre-existent. They do not pre-exist their operations. So we can get into the distinction between the abstract machine, the machinic assemblage, and the machinic element, which is not quite a term that is used, but the machinic element, I would say, is like a thing that comes, an alterity that comes in from outside and has this machinic function of destabilizing, of deterritorializing, but opening up, like we discussed, affording the possibility of a re-territorialization. And it comes in with a series of cutting edges. Let me just find this. There's a really nice quote from 1,000 Plateaus. Where is it? Okay, yeah. So here they're also talking about the distinction between a machine and an assemblage. But a machine is like a set of cutting edges that insert themselves into the assemblage. So you imagine a pre-constituted concrete assemblage, a particular order of relationality with a particular power of enunciation, particular functions. We could get rich with biological examples, obviously, but and also more than biological or non-biological, so to speak, examples. But the machine is a set of cutting edges that insert themselves into the assemblage, undergoing deterritorialization, and they draw variations and mutations out of it. And here we go. For there are no mechanical effects. Effects are always machinic. In other words, always depend on a machine that is plugged into an assemblage and has been freed through deterritorialization. So the concepts proliferate and it can be difficult to pass some of these things, but effects are always machinic. They depend on a machine that's plugged into an assemblage. So there are no effects in isolation, right? Obviously, right? The effects that any given element has are radically dependent on the other things that it's interacting with, are radically context dependent. Effects of this kind can be very diverse, but are never symbolic or imaginary. They always have a real value. And this is the connection to what we were talking about with the desiring machines earlier. But the abstract, so I mean, it's important also, I won't go on, I'll let you respond, but to distinguish between a number of these other bits of terminology that are used in this essay and also in the co-authored works with Deleuze, like diagrammatic schema, abstract machine, and its relation to the assemblage, concrete assemblage, machinic assemblage, et cetera, but we can continue getting to that. The key point, though, is that the mechanical and mechanism is this atomistic kind of anti-relational mode. And to also presage the critique of autopoiesis versus allopoiesis, Guattari thinks that Varela and Maturana, in the way they distinguish living systems as autopoietic from technical objects, which are allopoietic, meaning they don't produce themselves, they produce something other than themselves, like an assembly line, is also neglecting the fact that the technical object, as Leroy-Gohan, he quotes Andre Leroy-Gohan as saying this, is kind of nothing outside of the broader machinic assemblage that it's embedded within, which it always, of course, implicates the human, designers, engineers, users, the cultural inframing, or, blah, blah, blah. So when you expand the horizon, technical objects are always embedded within broader autopoietic networks in that sense. And then the critique of the biological autopoiesis is, well, is that all that different for organisms? And to what extent are they constituted by alterities and don't, as Guattari says, implacably fold in on themselves?
Yeah. So it's a question of scale,
Yeah.
whether the parts are in fact bound up in this relational nexus whereby they end up producing themselves. And so Varela was very resistant to autopoiesis being applied beyond the cellular and organismic level to include like, social systems and whatnot. I know there are sociologists who did try to do that. Um, but I can see also though why Guattari appreciates autopoiesis and the idea of autopoietic machines because it does allow us to recognize the way in which we might have had this idealization of the machine as parts outside of parts, but that in concrete um, practice, the machines that we use, the parts that enter into them do change one another and are bound up in a process of mutual production. He uses the lock and key example
Yeah.
in the way that, both of these elements are constantly changing one another. And so that there does become this process of mutual production of the parts. And so all machines are autopoietic. And this division between living and non-living machines gets softened, although Guattari will still refer to, you know, that distinction. He's not trying to totally collapse it. But
Because,
yeah, this allopoetic distinction becomes problematic.
yeah.
And so if we could just offer a very simple, maybe hopefully not oversimplifying phrase for what machine means for them here, um, any process of production is a machine. Is that a fair,
I think
simplistic
that
statement?
that's part of it. I think it's they're trying. I mean, to reference something that we said or you said, quoting Heraclitus, though, last week, the way up and the way down are one and the same. I think what's really important about the machine for these guys, because now we would need to bring in the notion of the abstract machine or the diagrammatic schema as well. But the machine is simultaneously the it's like the machine is the whole or the machinic is the whole process of the production of the new, which involves these cutting edges, involves the unzipping of some pre-existent reference frame, some pre-existent structure, as well as the constitution of a novel thing. So it's productive, it's constructive, but it's simultaneously always destructive. So he says something somewhere about, there's a very structural realist thing in here as well. But the new machine is built on the old machine, but there's a bit Hegelian via its negation, almost to the point of excretion. He says, or maybe that's in Machine and Structure, but yeah, it's that whole process, and then the role, and then we can distinguish the abstract machine, the concrete assemblage, machinic assemblage, and the role of the machine specifically in deterritorialization. But so it's that whole process of production which always involves the deterritorialization from some old, like the new always involves the death of something, basically, right? And so yeah.
So when we talk about Varela's and Matrana's distinction between organization and the organizational closure and the materiality of an autopoietic uh, being, um, the concern that Varela has there is to avoid thinking of organisms as just input output devices, but that there's a closure for him signals that how an organism behaves depends on its own internal dynamics and not on a simple sense of interpreting pre-existing information in the environment, because all information is going to be relative to the organizational um, operations of that autopoietic being from Varela's point of view. And I don't hear Guattari wanting to mm, challenge the input-output issue, but to recognize the way in which this distinction between organization and materiality is problematic, and that the materiality of an organism maybe isn't changed in this simple input-output way, um, but is constantly being affected by its relations to um, other processes in its environment. And so that strict separation between organism or between organization and materiality becomes highly problematic, because every autopoietic machine is being transformed by its environment and transforming that environment in turn, right? Um,
And can
and
only do
so,
the things it can only do the things that it can do, can only manifest a distinct power of enunciation in Guattari's in a particular context. So again,
mm,
that's you, we, subjects, but objects of all kind are distinct entities because they have distinct affordances, they have distinct powers of expression, they have distinct functional roles in different contexts. So they are always co-constituted by alterities as opposed to, again, implacably folding in on themselves. It's not that the same organism goes from one context to another and it's so autopoietically inviolable that it, I mean, and of course this differs for organisms of all kinds. There are different strategies that organisms have,
right.
but at some level of analysis, and you mentioned scale, at some level of analysis we are talking about a different phenotype, um, because the behavior is going to have to change at the very least of an organism in different environments. So it is novelly constituted by the relations that it enters into.
Mm.
Um,
This closure is also problematic for other reasons that Guattari points out. The bottom of page 39, when he says that autopoiesis, which is supposed to be the essence of life, lacks characteristics essential to living organisms, like the fact that they're born, they die, and that they survive through genetic phylums or lineages. And he says autopoiesis deserves, so he wants to preserve some of its the insights from this concept, but it deserves to be rethought in terms of evolutionary collective entities which maintain diverse types of uh, relations of alterity rather than being implacably closed in on themselves. Um, and so, this reminds me of an argument that Evan Thompson makes in his book Mind and Life, in an argument against the neo-Darwinian point of view, where he'll say autopoiesis or self-production logically precedes reproduction. Um,
mm,
so that, in other words, it's giving autopoiesis conceptual priority over any kind of process of genetic replication and selection, and that's also part of evolution, of course. But it's almost like autopoiesis becomes the master category and is somehow existing before an evolutionary lineage. Um, and as I thought about Guattari's critique here, it I used to really appreciate this point that autopoietic theorists would make, um, because what it does that I like is it short circuits any attempt to explain living organization, or to claim that natural selection somehow explains living organization, at the level of autopoiesis, because it presupposes that. But at the same time, if we're going to define life as autopoiesis, we're leaving out this whole thing, not just evolutionary lineages, but birth and death. Um, right? Because presumably every autopoietic being has to come into being,
yeah.
and there's quite a gap there.
Well,
Um,
it has to be given. I mean, autopoietic organisms as they come into being, today,
right,
as we discussed, are like radically dependent on their lineages, and the cell, like the actual autopoietic entity, is not initially something that generates itself. It's generated by the previous generation of autopoietic entity, and just given that.
right.
Um, but also, I mean, we've talked about this a bunch of times, but that also, all of that argument kind of is contingent upon some sort of scale or degree of abstraction to which you are subjecting any of the given terms. So again, it's like, what is natural selection? Okay, natural selection in neo-Darwinian terms is defined very narrowly, right? But if you diagram natural selection in the sort of Peirce-Lewontin way of doing it, and again, we're just like variation, selection, inheritance. In what sense could you define autopoietic self-organization in opposition to, as the antithesis of, reproduction? No, it is a process of reproduction. That is what homeoresis, dynamic, self-similar behavior, same flows, continually returning to the same flow. That's what autopoiesis is. It is a process of temporal reproduction of a particular eigenform, a particular, attractor, non-equilibrium, steady state, blah, 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 lots of different ways to language it. And some of which I know that, core autopoietic theorists would like more than others. But it is a process of reconstituting and, in a sense, reproducing. Again, not in the classic, quote unquote, neo-Darwinian sense, or really even in the Darwinian sense, but what's much more interesting here, rather than squabbling about who has priority or whatever, is, again, I'm just interested in this exercise of both impoverishing to the most kind of abstract operational level, and then we can rebuild into the sticky, messy details, and we must, of any given material reality. But it's only in that move, again, the oscillation, blah, 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 between the most abstract, at which, when we're diagramming, the relations are most starkly revealed, and then rebuilding how is this particular, or indeed is this particular material reality a manifestation of that abstract analysis. And if it isn't, if we can't map it onto it, then we have found a flaw, or at least a limit to the generality of our diagrammatic schema here, and it's using that in a slightly different way to the way they're using it, actually, so that could be misleading. Shall I quickly just talk about the abstract machine? Well, actually, how about we disambiguate in this sense between technical objects and animals, because Guattari does actually explicitly say it's not an animal at one point, right? Hang on, where's the right quote? Right. So what defines a machine is its singular power of enunciation, like what it can do. What does it bring forth? What does it express? What's its function? What does it reveal? What does it facilitate? And again, that's always going to be relationally defined, constituted by alterities in some particular milieu, because any given thing will do a different thing. And again, this is very, very key to our understandings of the origins of novelty within biology, which again I would love to get to at least a little bit, the chemistry, the exochemistry and molecular evolution aspects here. But it's the machine's singular power of enunciation rather than its autonomy, bracket, it's not an animal, right? So by fixating on autonomy and making autonomy the definition of the animal, Guattari also thinks we're obscuring something here. And I think he's problematizing in a lot of ways, and throughout their work, Deleuze and Guattari are obviously problematizing autonomy in some kind of abject or limit case of voluntarism, right? Like we wouldn't be so easily captured in all the ways they're trying to problematize if we were so autonomous, right? And autopoiesis is a theory of autonomy. And of course, it is in its nuanced form a theory of relative autonomy. And so Guattari is just wanting to quickly just do away with that. I'm not talking about autonomy here. The machine per se, or in its most general form, is not necessarily autonomous. It's not an animal, but it can do things.
Yeah, it's like the autopoiesis, the traditional theory is it seems to reify a kind of formal autonomy and separate that from material and energetic relationality and coupling. to the environment. And I think that's a Kantian inheritance, I would say. That's just part of the phenomenological context out of which the autopoietic approach was born. But there's one really helpful two sentences here on 42 where he talks about a heap. He says a heap of stones is not a machine, whereas a wall is already a static proto-machine manifesting virtual polarities. He means an inside and an outside, above and below, right and left. These diagrammatic virtualities take us beyond Varela's characterization of machinic autopoiesis as unitary individuation, or autonomy, we could say, with neither input nor output. They direct us towards a more collective machinism without delimited unity, whose autonomy accommodates diverse mediums of alterity. Um, and so there's still a preservation of some sense of autonomy, but sort of um, perforated or penetrated by alterity. And, I couldn't help but think of Whitehead's category of societies here.
Mm-hmm.
And when you were describing how, an autopoietic being is already it's engaged in a process of homeoresis or reproduction of itself. Um, that's very much what Whitehead means by society, is that there's that we're talking more about a swarm of uh, maybe relative autonomy, and that a swarm has some sense of there's some kind of agency at work, but it's a very distributed agency that's yeah, punctuated by alterity, um, and emergent from multiplicity. And so it seems like what's lacking in the autopoietic framework is a recognition not just of material um, flows, but that also at the level of our organization. And this is also where subjectivity comes in for autopoietic theorists, at least later on. If maybe the original formulation, they weren't so much thinking in terms of the what Varela would later call the subject pole and the center of concern, and drawing on Hans Jonas um, to flesh out the phenomenology of life. Um, that this is also a flowing sort of process. Subjectivity flows into and out of subjects flow into another and out of other subjects, rather than just the material flowing.
And I think two things we should be clear on. It's not that there aren't autopoietic processes. It's not that there isn't, conditional independence, conditional folding back, and that and that's actually a very important part of what a machinic assemblage does, and what a virtual governor does, and the way that in a contingent and ephemeral manner there is a certain kind of self, but ephemeral, but over obviously all sorts of different timescales. There is a self similarity and a self reference and a reproduction of the self, and all of those things are super important. And also one of the ways that the autopoieticists respond to some of this stuff is to reference their notion of structural coupling, um, and um, and there's an interesting relationship with, in the free energy principle literature, the notion of sparse coupling. But in the autopoietic literature, there's a distinction between structure and organization, right? So there's structural coupling, which is like a material coupling, but organization is autonomous, is independent from that. And I think that, yes, Guattari is very much problematizing that kind of hard cut between the material and the organizational there. Like you said, there's a kind of formal notion of autonomy, but there is a very formal aspect to some of this as well. Some of this Guattari's, some of this, Deleuze-Guattarian, system or set of principles. And that partly is going to bring in, importantly, this notion of the abstract machine, or the diagrammatic schema. And that can start to sound like a form or a formalism, right? Because it is the well, I mean, it's basically the form, but it's the diagram of the relationships, the way they are, the way they are organized, and then the particular kind of directionality or canalizing that they are flowing towards by virtue of this particular organization that they have. So the diagram or the abstract machine, they say in the Foucault book, or Deleuze says in the Foucault book, sorry, and they partly credit this notion diagram with coming from Foucault, but of course here in machinic heterogenesis, Guattari also rightly emphasizes the Peircean connection. But the diagram acts as a non-unifying immanent cause that is coextensive with the whole social field in the Foucauldian sense. And so Anne Sofanage, who is like a very helpful secondary commentator on a lot of this literature, does then argue that a diagram is also what Deleuze and Guattari call an abstract machine. And a key thing about an abstract machine as opposed to a form in a kind of hylomorphic model is that the abstract machine doesn't pre-exist its operation or its enunciation, but is actually constituted by it. And so there's a strong analogy actually, because it's immanent to the flows that it is canalizing. It's not transcendent. It's not over and above them. Even though I think in the Kafka book they do talk about it being transcendent, but I think that they moved on from that, and maybe that was a furphy, or maybe I need to revisit that. But so it's basically akin to a virtual governor, like a dissipative system that forms and becomes canalizing for the period of its existence. So it is an organizer of relations, but again, it's immanent to the material that it's organizing. But so one of the ways that we can articulate the difference between the technical object per se, the technical machine, and the machinic more broadly, or indeed the biological object, is the status of the abstract machine, the status of the diagrammatic schema, which is correlative to or perhaps synonymous with the abstract machine. And in a technical object, right, there's a sense in which the abstract machine, the diagram, pre-exists the object, right, in the mind of the inventor. So the inventor has some plan that they want to realize, and then they build something which is in accordance with that plan. Whereas in natural systems, the abstract machine is wholly immanent to the system, doesn't have this pre-existence, but we can abstract it through an analytical study of that system. So we can reverse engineer a system as opposed to engineering it as we do with technical objects. But then there's a subtle and important analysis that I think Simondon provides, and Simondon is himself differentiating between technical machines and biological systems along these lines. But then he has this analysis of concretization, which shows that in the mind of the inventor or the mind of the engineer, the mind of the manufacturer, blah, 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 creator, the diagrammatic scheme, the abstract machine is vague in a way prior to the initial prototype being built. And then it's only through this process that Simondon calls concretization, which really is a process of conjectures and refutations, very much in a similar manner to a kind of natural selection. A phenotype is constructed, so it's artificial selection. A phenotype is constructed, and then its aptness is tested. How well does it perform the particular function? So at the limit, the abstract machine is a kind of function. And so in biology, we can think about function classes. We can think about like venom, which has the function of, via its active inoculation, via its active injection, subduing or deterring target organisms. That is an abstract machine defined at the level of function. And then that abstract machine actually has been realized, in 100 different lineages independently and blah, blah, blah. So there is a way that the abstract machine at its most abstract limit is independent of the material reality. But there's a way that as we zoom in on the material reality, the abstract machine and its materiality, but and all of its details kind of converge in the real object, in the concrete assemblage. But in Simondonian concretization, kind of infelicities in the original relatively vague diagram are only realized by the inventor via their realization, their actualization, their concretization in a particular object. And then there's this iterative process of, in fact, changing the parts in a relational manner, sometimes fusing the function of two parts together, sometimes disassociating the function of a single part, which is doing too many things or interfering with itself in some way. And so there is this very relational thing that's happening, and it's only in the fully mature, say, fully concretized technical object that you could even have really this sense of parts, extra parts, right? In the process of designing and manufacturing and, optimizing in relation to a particular function, a technical object, it is going through this relational machinic process in which the parts, because of the way they interfere with each other or because of the way they synergize with each other, etc., are absolutely modifying each other and modifying their status in the next round of design. But so the key distinction, because there was a lot of waffle between the technical machine and the biological, is that the abstract machine, the diagram basically, in a sense pre-exists, but in a vague form, the technical object. But in no real sense does it do that with the natural system. It's wholly immanent there, but we can abstract it through analysis. So it's kind of engineering versus reverse engineering is one of the key distinctions between the technical and the natural in that sense.
Right, right. I was quite intrigued by this notion of abstract machines and diagramming. So I dug in a little bit here because it felt to me quite resonant with Whitehead's idea of propositions, which are kind of these hybrid entities that exist between possibility and actuality, and so not totally divorced from the actual, but opening up, prying open the actual to reveal the virtual. Um, and he even Guattari even uses the term machinic propositions at one point. Um, he says machinic propositions elude the ordinary games of discursivity, and so they're not simply reducible to symbolic expressions, and they elude the structural coordinates of energy, time, and space, and so they're not fully physical either. So they're almost they exist at a kind of virtual level, though always engaged with various forms of um, actualization and realization in material and semiotic forms or symbolic forms. Um, and he was wanting to point out the ways that abstract machines allow us, they're transversal, right? So they allow us to move between these different levels, like the biological, the social, the aesthetic, the technological proper.
They knit by being transversal, they relate those levels, they knit them together. So we
Really good
have
point.
those
Yeah.
levels that are analytically distinct, but the abstract machine is an analysis in that case of how they are co-implicated, interdependent with one another. Yeah.
So they connect these different domains, but not by creating some sort of homogeneous or not through a sort of universals in the Platonic sense. Yeah, he specifically says that this is not about harmonic universals of the Platonic type, um, but rather he says the composition of deterritorializing intensities is incarnated in abstract machines, and so there's a real incarnational
Mm.
vector here,
I think
which
sorry, you go.
no, go ahead.
There is this ambiguity and obvious relationship to Platonism here. But part of the key, I mean, as for Whitehead, as for Peirce in their different ways, and we have that beautiful Peirce quote on the process of evolution of the universe is a process in which the forms themselves have evolved. There's a very, very strong temporal, aspect to these abstract machines, in the sense that, I mean, obviously, even in the technical sense, they don't pre-exist their operation in the mind of the inventor, right? They're
Yeah.
always contingent, because they're immanent. They're really trying to, like Deleuze and Guattari, are really trying to think this immanent thing where the principle of organization is immanent to the flows. Remember, the desiring machine itself is in the real, but cuts real flows. So these processes are not ontologically distinct. It's not a pre-constituted form that comes
Mhm.
and imbues some passive matter or whatever. The form is itself constituted in the action of the matter. And I also love when you mentioned the swarm, and there's an interesting analysis there, obviously, of like flocking behavior and things like that, where there is an organizational mode that is very much emergent from, immanent to, the very local interactions between the members of the swarm, right? So the bird or the fish is only obeying a very, very simple rule of like maintain a certain distance between your neighbors above and beside you. And each bird or fish behaving in that way, which also drives them to move back towards the center when they are on the edges, on the periphery of the swarm, creates these incredible patterns of murmuration and all of that. And we know that those are very easy to model computationally, actually. And this is a good lesson, too, about the nature of emergence, and why emergence is not necessarily more like information rich than the sum of its parts, often radically less than, right? So Timothy Morton has subscendence as a notion, but this is kind of a standard, notion in complexity, that the collective action constrains the actions of the individual. So it's generating this reference frame that is constituted by, but in a sense over and above, the actions of the individuals,
Yeah.
canalizes their behavior. And I always like to say, like, you'd never make a convincing computational model of an individual Starling, much less its physiology and everything, but its behavior. It hops here, it hops there, it scratches itself, it looks for a worm, but you can easily make a computational model of a murmuration. And we look at a murmuration and we're like, oh, wow, it's so complex. And it's like that. It's actually very simple. The individuals are where the complexity is at in that particular example. Sorry, I derailed you a bit.
Yeah, no, Morton's concept of implosive wholeness versus explosive wholeness, kind of cheap holism, I think is really helpful here. And thinking more in terms of assemblages than,
Mm.
um, a fixed form of wholeness. Um, but yeah, I think that these abstract machines, or the function of diagramming here, I think is a nice bridge. And I think I'm constantly looking for ways to translate what Whitehead means by propositions, because it's so he that to choose that term, it just invites misunderstanding because he's taking it out of um, logic and trying to generalize. But there is something about abstract machines that's not reducible to specific instances. And it's just that we have this Platonic lineage, and so we want to say, oh, so it's a universal. But I think barring Bergson's idea of virtuality, and you were talking about Simondon and the vagueness of um, these diagrams, these abstractions, that they really don't become. It's not in essence waiting to be realized. It becomes what it is in relationship um, to the material that it's engaged with and that it is diagramming. So
Yeah.
there's just that tension is always held between the virtual and the actual, rather than there being some separately pre-existing domain of universals.
Predefined, you know,
Mhm.
pre-canalized, predeterminate forms.
Yeah.
It is that process of actualization, which is the coming to definiteness or determinacy or whatever. Yeah, and I think that's a big thing that Simondon definitely articulates really
So it's
nicely.
an immanentization of abstraction that I think, yeah, is really generative.
Yeah.
Um,
The immanent transcendent, which these guys do use that term, and I don't know if they get it directly from Jung, but Jung
mm,
also says that, right?
mhm.
Um, mm,
Do you want to talk about the difference between Guattari's view of technology and Heidegger's view of technology. He does name drop Heidegger once in talking about the Concord, the commercial plane, um,
Yeah.
in ways that I thought, you know, I love his way of talking about how Heidegger turned the world of technology into a kind of malefic destiny resulting from a movement of distancing from being. And, so much of Guattari's work and Deleuze's work and their work together is an attempt to resist fascism, and not just the fascism of others or governments and states, but the little fascist inside of each of us. Um,
Mm.
this desire for not only the desire for power over others, but even there's a desire to be dominated and controlled by others, Um, and I think,
Lacan, Lacan says to the student protesters in 68 or whatever, you are in search of a master and you will find one. Yeah.
right, yeah. And so, yeah, this because I have, of course, I have found Heidegger's reading of technology and Gestell and standing reserve and all that stuff to be important and deep and worth taking seriously, but it does become so deterministic, and the alternative sort of, oh, let's recover our authentic relationship to being, can seem almost like it's like self-caricaturing. It's like, there are these photographs of Heidegger at his hut, getting water from the well, and it's just like he's trying really hard to not be a professor and to pretend like he's, just one of the peasants. And it becomes cosplay, you know. And the level of inauthenticity at the end of the day, I think, is quite striking and comes through in those photographs I've seen of him. And
the
um,
obsession, the obsession with authenticity as an abstract concept, right?
right.
Leading to such inauthentic. I will be so authentic. Yeah, leading to such inauthentic behavior. Sure.
Yeah, and then you end up with these fascist temptations. And so this is all subtly connected. And it's not that anyone who takes Heidegger's reading of technology seriously ends up becoming a fascist, but at the same time, I think recognizing there's a sort of defeatism in it, to say that all technology is, revealing nature to us and us to ourselves in a way that destines us um, to be inauthentic. Um, I think what Guattari points out is that, every every machine is unique, it performs unique functions. There's no single essence of technology or of the machinic anymore. That we're talking about singular um, processes, and that the work that, whether we're talking about technology or the machinic in general, the productive work that's done is, it's always precarious. And so, like, you have a great design for a machine, a diagram, you build the machine, um, it breaks down, it doesn't function right, and there's a whole assemblage of economic and psychological and so on factors that go into that machine continuing to function in the way that you expect it to. And so there are all these opportunities to recognize um, the precariousness and singularity of these machinic processes that Heidegger's reading totally covers over. Um, and
Because
yeah, go ahead.
this is your point. It's the treating of technology as an abstract universal,
All right.
and what Guattari is emphasizing, and I love that, with all of this wonderful technology and all these things coming together around the Concord, it remains nailed to the economic ground, Um, but Guattari is really emphasizing what Stuart Kaufman would call unprestatability. And so not only are, machines singular,
Right.
and there's this process of concretization, like you don't know until you've built the thing how the parts are going to interact and what modifications you're going to need to make and all of that. the actual detailed reality of developing a piece of technology. But then, I mean, the assemblages required, especially for something like a Concorde, but for many pieces of technology, to facilitate the funding, et cetera, to facilitate the manufacture of the object in the first place. But then the context in which the complete object is going to be inserted, and the unprestatable ways it's going to interact, because the machine is temporality invades the machine from all sides, as Guattari says. But so it's going into these relational contexts and these networks that open onto networks that open onto networks. It's open, it's historically open on all sides, diachronically and synchronically, evolutionarily and ecologically open. And that same machine, again, same machine transported to different contexts will enter into different relational networks and have different effects. And so, far from it being a thought of determinism here, it's the opposite thought that's being emphasized here with the notion of the machinic, that when the novel thing, the alter, the outside thing comes into the particular context, it changes that context by virtue of its not having been predefined by that context. So it's an opening and an opening and an opening rather than an inframing that is ultimately a closing, the end of metaphysics or whatever. And there are obviously different ways of thinking about that. And we talked about Sherman last week. But it's not a closure. It's not the end of something. It's just the beginning of all of these, proliferation of ontological universes of reference, as Guattari will say, that we just can't, we can't pre-state them because they are engendered by this process itself. They don't pre-exist. Now, there might be some way in which virtually they are, their possibility is present prior to their actual instantiation, but that possibility itself is dynamically bound up with the diachronic and synchronic materialities associated with the manifestation of the thing. So the possibility is itself continually being changed based on the situation. So yeah, at every level, it's a thought of disruption, of unprestatability, of anti-canalization, of the way new canals are proliferated or whatever, rather than Heidegger's end of all things under the technological determinism of inframing, blah blah blah. So yeah, it's totally antithetical. Yeah.
And later he talks about the ontological relativity that's implied here, and I would want to say ontological relationality instead, just because I think this, I'm totally on board with the idea of universes and a pluriverse, ontological pluralism, but I think there's a way of maintaining uh, some effective concept of truth when we emphasize relationality here and not just relativity. But nonetheless, he points out that he says knowledge of a universe in an astrophysical or in an axiological sense is only possible through the mediation of autopoietic machines. And so, in other words, this role that the machine plays in mediating between the human being and um, the non-human world in all its diversity, it's it's a recognition of, I think, what you can't. I mean, Heidegger has a lot to say about tools too, as mediators, but um, it to me speaks to the inescapability of our mediation and the role that whether we're talking about physical or technical machines or abstract machines, that knowledge is never, it's not representational in the sense that there's a kind of mirroring of some sort of mental symbol that's similar to some kind of physical object. But nor is there any transparency in our knowing. It's knowledge is always a mutually transformative process. And um, but I think yeah, I wonder how comfortable you are with his term ontological relativity there, because I think if we reframe what we mean by knowledge and into a more participatory type of paradigm, then we can preserve a sense of truth not as simple correspondence anymore or representation, um, but truth becomes like a mode of um, I don't know, shared enunciation or a kind of rethought as an event that one um, um, that we experience together in a moment, and then sure, maybe that particular truth becomes lost or sedimented by subsequent moments, and we have to rediscover some novel relationship to a new truth in the next moment. But um, I worry about ontological relativity as the way of characterizing what's going on as these, universes overlap and diverge, and we seek some sort of uh, abstract way of traversing them without ever reducing them to some homogenized language. But yeah,
Yeah.
how do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think he's necessarily talking about a kind of, well, I don't think he's talking about a kind of abject relativism. I think this is more akin to the notion of worlding, and the ontological turn in anthropology would, essentially indicate that, different peoples inhabit different worlds, different relational networks, and the way the imaginary, the mythological, etc., and all of that is bound up in the kinds of relationships that, humans can enter into with non-human agents and all of that kind of stuff. It's a different world of different powers in this sense, right? So that the movers and shakers, so to speak, are differently defined. But I think that yes, to your point, the real task of the kind of, ontological, metaphysical constructivism that we are interested in, and looking at these various thinkers for, inspiration and help with, is to apply this middle ground between some kind of, naive universalizing form of realism, as we might sometimes see in scientism, but also in various hegemonic traditions which have said this is the, this perspective on the world is the way the world is fundamentally, and everything else is delusion or whatever, to a perspectivalist view in which the proliferation of perspectives, let's say, is just another version of the proliferation of novelty at various sort of levels of reference, or levels of reality.
Mm,
So yes, proliferating a novel perspective on a particular concrete reality, to say concrete assemblage, but kind of imposing a distinct abstract machine. So via analysis, understanding a concrete assemblage in a different way than the way you were given to understand it, so to speak, or just the way you'd understood it previously, is actually part of the process of generating, novel lines of flight, which are always themselves feeding back on that, on the same, because, Deleuze and Guattari are also thinkers of, of univocity. It's a
mm,
highly multiple univocity, but we are talking about an integrated plane of immanence. Everything ultimately is in this same plane of immanence. And there are all of these planes of consistency that are above that, and those are organized by abstract machines which render things, relational networks, consistent in these particular areas. But we, as analyzers, can potentially derive distinct, we can abstract, we can coarse grain a particular reality in different ways, and that is the generation of novel perspectives. And again, what we would want to say is that the process by which we do that is like Whitehead says, that beautiful quote from Symbolism, right, which I'm not going to quote because I'll butcher it, but basically when humans abstract, they are doing something that nature already does. Nature itself abstracts in this particular sense. So we generate a novel perspective on something, and that allows us to interact with it in a slightly different way. And that will change its material future because, again, our perspective is always bound up in, always imminent to the systems in which we are interacting with, mediated by that perspective. But I mean, all that is just kind of a way of saying that there's unity at a particular level, but there can simultaneously be many different ways of seeing a thing. And obviously, one way we've talked about that is in terms of Peircean, the triune real, and the kind of Peircean perspectivism. But within each of those things, there could nonetheless be a lot of different, particularly at the levels of secondness and thirdness, right? There are a lot of different ways you could relate to something with it. That's why I say mosaic realism. It's not just that there are these three stances, it's that within each of those three modes of engagement, you could nonetheless be engaging in things in very different ways. And even at the level of firstness, you could be standing over there and I could be standing over here and we could be looking at the same object and we could be emptying and doing all of that and, fully engaging. But just because we are in a different location, we will nonetheless, the thing will be revealed to us, different aspects of the thing will be revealed to us. And I think that's what's being talked about here. And then when he talks about, the bringing into being of ontological universes and things like that, and he has a nice little, excursus on musical universes of reference and things like that, and the way like a refrain, and this I want to get to in a second. I mean, I've been going on too long already, but there's a way that the notion of the refrain, which is developed in A Thousand Plateaus, is important here as well, and bringing back to the machinic, the repetition of the particular and how that begins to generate a novel's universe, basically. But he says that a pentatonic musical refrain, which with only a few notes catalyzes the Debussyist constellation of multiple universes, and then the various he goes through like Debussy's lineage in some sense with Wagner and Gregorian chant and French music and Javanese music and all these things that go into the style of music that is then Debussy's style. And when you hear a little bit of Debussy, you're in this, what's, I mean, if you're familiar with the music, what's coming. You're in this frame of reference. You're in this abstract machine, this Debussyist universe, which is comprised of all these heterogeneous elements that are his influences, made into some consistent whatever whole. But then on the other side of that, those things that derive from Debussy, its repercussions on the French musical phylum of Ravel, Duparc, Messiaen, etc., and on the sonorous mutation triggered by Stravinsky. It's I've got a little, you probably won't be able to see this, but this is from like really old notes, but it's convergence and divergence. All of these influences converge in Debussy's sonorous universe in a particular abstract machine, let's say, and then they diverge again into all these other different things. And I think that's the kind of process that he's really talking about. I don't know if I'm quite getting to your concern here, but I don't equate ontological relativity with relativism in the sense that this doesn't enable there to be some kind of truth or different levels of truth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's something he repeats twice about um, the law of excluded middle and the principle of sufficient reason. He says we need to abandon such logics. And, I'm sympathetic to that, but I also think abandon might be a little too strong because, like Whitehead has these two forms of analysis, genetic analysis of concrescence, where yes, the law of excluded middle, principle of identity, like these things don't hold yet because there's still a process of virtualization working itself out before a decision as to how to actualize that would disambiguate whether it's this or that. And so in the process of concrescence, when we're doing genetic analysis, yes, we need other types of logic, or I think Whitehead would even say really we're leaning on aesthetics to do that analysis. But then when we're doing morphological or coordinate analysis, which is what physics does, we are talking about a domain where the law of excluded middle applies again. Um, it's either, a perished actual entity is either like this or it's like that. It's not in this ambiguous in between state anymore. And I think it's just a matter of knowing which domains these logics apply to and which they don't apply to. And abandon seems a little bit strong, and that's part of the reason I felt like the ontological relativity comment was maybe a little bit too cavalier. But I think we want to avoid any concept of universal truth
Yeah.
that would be imposed abstractly upon the multiplicity of singular perspectives. And so maybe there's something like a singularization of truth where we recognize that again in Whiteheadian terms, every actual occasion has its own actual world, and that there's a sort of truth by way of correspondence there. But then there's also a way of coordinating at least some aspects of the actual world remain similar enough across occasions that we can say do physics and coordinate
Yeah.
those truths.
Yes, and it is the genetic that ultimately provides the consistency to the coordinate. I would say, right? It's the fact that
Yeah.
things are part of a shared lineage.
Right.
But I think we could certainly critique Guattari for some of the language, and probably for not having a complete system as well. Like he's certainly not the systematic thinker that Whitehead is. Um, but I think what's actually key here, and this is going to be a little bit difficult to articulate, but on after that whole thing about the musical universes of reference, and where he gets, I think it's the second time where he talks about removing us from the logic of the excluded middle and reinforcing us in our dismissal of the ontological binarism we criticized previously. Now, he does, I think, still want to escape from the binarism that you're kind of almost, articulating. Whitehead has a different binarism, maybe, but there's still a kind of binary relationship there almost between what would be in Deleuzian and Guattarian terms, the virtual and the actual. And then, Whitehead has his notion that the actual is incurably atomic and all of that. And these guys are going really hard on this immanentist framework where they want to get rid of that. But what he introduces in the same paragraph, a machinic assemblage through its diverse components extracts its consistency by crossing ontological thresholds, non-linear thresholds of irreversibility, blah, 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 blah. The notion of scale needs to be expanded to consider fractal symmetries in ontological terms. What fractal machines traverse are substantial scales. They traverse them in engendering them, blah, blah, blah. And there's more really nice stuff to come right after that. But we've talked about this a number of times. So the virtual and the actual are not related in this binary sense, but they're always relative to some particular reference frame in this sense, like a temporal reference frame. They're epochal, right? And so if I'm speaking about, if you're thinking about the organism and the body without organs, and the machinic element there, are the unprecanalized by the organization at the specific level that you are defining it. So let's say the organism as a whole. So the stochastic gene expression, which is unprecanalized by that, which is kind of flying off in all different directions and just happening in a relatively arbitrary manner, but then becomes machinic when it has a particular like confluence of events that bring it into a relational network, that then it spawns a new kind of frame of reference. It has a novel activity in that situation, which is then amplified. And I want to get to that in a second as well. But it's the way in which you can think more, maybe a different binary to introduce would be the noise and information binary, and how those are always frame relative, and those frames are nested in any given kind of complex system. So fractal machines traversing substantial scales. So rather than having the kind of the actual, which is the physical universe, and the virtual, the potential or whatever, which is somehow distinct from that, this is a way that the levels of abstraction, actually levels of constructive coarse graining, create a situation where you have that which is actualized, which is kind of determinate in its form and its temporal directionality, so that which is canalized in some homoeoretic flow at this level of analysis, and that which is stochastic or excessive of that particular reference frame, but is always either perturbing it and causing the whole thing to kind of drift over time, but also could, through some kind of saltatory movement, like movement of a leap, by inserting a molecule into a different context in a relatively arbitrary way, it enters into a suite of novel relations. It's in a novel milieu. It encounters novel interaction partners, and that can lead to the generation of a novel abstract machine in a kind of saltatory manner. He talks about hypertext somewhere, and he likes this idea that it's early internet, right? He likes the idea that a hypertext, you leap from one frame of reference, which I guess is like the web page that you're on, through some sort of liminal, dark, whatever space to another frame of reference. And I think about that in these terms, in terms of a molecule being introduced to a novel context. And if the confluence of events is right, selection can then amplify that in the construction of a novel reference frame. But again, in kind of FEP type terms, these reference frames are also temporally nested, and there's a kind of actual and virtual, or information and noise, or whatever, binary, solenoidal and dissipative, or whatever, relationship that is recapitulated at every level. So everything there is like actual in one sense, is material, but some of it is just stochastic, and some of it is ordered. And I think that's the kind of conception that they're trying to get to here, because that's a very immanentist view where there isn't so much something that, I mean, there's definitely a development of the immaterial, and certainly in earlier Deleuze and later Deleuze, it's very big. I think Guattari might be even harder, going on these material realities. And I'm not saying that it's sorted out, and maybe all of that was not clear what I just said, but I think that's what we're looking at here, because then he'll get onto basically a notion of like criticality and things like that. Like he's very much drawing on systems theoretic and non-equilibrium thermodynamics here. Blah 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 blah. The assemblage is allowed to escape from the energetico-spatial temporal. Yeah, okay, no, it's only going to make it more confusing if I go into that. Yeah, there's something I want to get to on this, again, just to get back to a quote that begins with the essence of the machine and the amplification of particularity and the role of repetition, even in the constitution of autopoietic, reference frames. And so why, again, that notion that the autopoietic predates the reproductive, I think is mistaken. But I'll stop now and let you respond to all of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, to clarify the apparent binary in Whitehead's account of these two modes of analysis, the ability to do coordinate analysis of, say, the inorganic physical world is always a kind of as if, because it excludes the mental pole, and every actual occasion has a mental pole, and we're only ever observing as scientists these natural processes, only ever observing the universe within the context of a concrescence, within the context of another occasion of experience, which always is going to include a mental pole. And so we're always in process of actualization, but we do physics in this sort of as if mode, looking at how we as a scientific community can coordinate our perspectives and use highly refined instruments and symbol systems to capture something invariant across occasions of experience. But that I think is quite consonant with what Guattari says in that same paragraph where he talks about ontological relativity, uh,
Mhm.
which I'd love to just read here because it's quite beautiful. He says the biosphere and the mechanosphere coupled on this planet focus a point of view of space, time, and energy. They trace an angle of the constitution of our galaxy. Outside of this particularized point of view, the rest of the universe exists in the sense that we understand existence here below, only through the virtual existence of other autopoietic machines at the heart of other biomechanospheres scattered throughout the cosmos. The relativity of points of view of space, time, and energy do not, for all that, absorb the real into the dream. So he's resisting a kind of idealism here. I mean, it sounds more like the kind of animist view or pan-experientialist view, to use different terms that both you and I would want to defend, that um, we can't imagine the universe as just mutely persisting, independent of the points of view that are brought forth um, by these um, by these machinic processes, right? Including organisms, but also are the assemblages that we're bound up in together.
Yeah, there aren't worlds, like there's no worlding going on in the absence of those things. Um, yeah, I think in terms of just back to the dismissal of the excluded middle, I think it's more or a chat like a more nuanced way of reading it in consonance with other things that he's saying. It's more like that only applies locally or in relative to some particular frame of reference, but shouldn't be considered a universal thing. And kind of by imposing that in a hegemonic manner, we would actually be missing all of this. The logic of processes of actualization, all of this machinic heterogenesis that is in fact going on, and that creates those frames of reference in the first instance. Yeah.
This is, I really, I mean, there's a lot of details to be worked out here, but this shift from the modern sort of Enlightenment idea of universal truth, and a form of universal rationality that would grant autonomous individuals access to universal truth through some method, science.
Mm.
That needs to be overcome. But I feel like the challenge then is to recover a form of truth that would be a truth rooted in singularity. Um, and I think actually there might be some interesting ways that um, the that religion can become helpful there, and particularly those religions that might emphasize an incarnational sort of vector where truth becomes personalized in a way and um, concretized instead of being abstract and universal. That's a whole other conversation that just occurs to me. But this project of like the singularization of truth strikes me as extremely important right now. Like, is there a effective form of truth that can be recovered that would provide um, some means of uh, uh, motivating us politically, for example, that wouldn't be subject to the capture of some kind of totalizing ideology, but that nonetheless would give us a sense that, we have seen through the um, various forms of mind control and subjectivization that have captured us. And truth can again become powerful to as a means of leveraging collective action to resist lies, to resist untruthfulness. But again, never in a way that would become sort of an independent kind of sorry, Plato, but Platonic form of universal truth, divorced from actual concrete particular struggles, So I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but it strikes me as important.
I think it's very important, and I think to reference something you brought up previously, truth is about the discovery of invariance, right? But these kinds of views from Whitehead to Sherman to Guattari, etc., do see invariance as epochal and relative. This doesn't
Yes.
mean slide into abstract relativism, but the question is like identification of the scale at which an invariant exists. And so some things are true for the entire cosmic epoch, and some things are very local in their truth and very, very singular in their truth. And the problem that we've had with, hegemonic truths with a capital T being imposed by one group of people onto another is the erection of a false, didn't mean to go all phallic there, but the, the phallocentric erection of a false universal, the claiming that some invariant that might apply to some particular at some particular temporal scale or to some particular, more likely, cultural collective, is in fact a truth for all time and for all people and all places and all of
Right.
that. The key analysis is, okay, I seem to have discovered an invariant. Is that just one of my habits? Is that
Mm.
one of my social group's habits, my cultural habits? Was I given that as I was interpolated into the symbolic order? Is that an invariant for the whole cosmic epoch that we're all going to have to be in conformity to? So it's absolutely not about abandoning the notion of truth, but it is about a nuanced and variegated approach to that truth. And of course, the question, which is a fundamentally scientific question, but again, we're so easily confused, and our motives make us want to be confused to some degree. Like, I want to discover this truth and then say it's true for all time and all places, because again, there's this, you referenced it right towards the beginning, there's a great deal of effort. There's an ethic of heterogenesis, and there's an effort of like constantly and reconstituting yourself, questioning the truths that up until right at this moment you had accepted, and you suddenly recognize something in your own reference frame that is subject to questioning that might not be an invariant at the scale at which you thought it was. But a lot of it is, it's misapprehension of the scale at which an invariant exists, I think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, towards the end of the chapter, he talks about constellations of universes of value, um, not being universals, not constituting universals. And I think something like a constellation of universes of value, which is always going to be perspectival, like a constellation is, looks different from different points of view. And also the stars are moving. And so these are always temporary constellations of universes of value. But I think something like that phrase captures what the singularization of truth would look like. It's a truth that's effective in a moment, um, and then needs to be overcome in a way so that it doesn't become an idol or mistaken for a universal. And so, as long as this um, process of heterogenesis is, I mean, that too can become an idol. I mean, and I can see how, as much as I love Deleuze and Guattari, there's a certain style of thinking that can actually just be somewhat superficial. They're not superficial. I mean, they're doing really profound conceptual work in their writing, and I find it profoundly generative to read. But I see even in myself a temptation to adopt this style, and it
Yeah.
becomes a kind of, yeah, um, a superficial way of branding and identifying that's merely semiotic or symbolic, and not actually doing the sorts of deeper political and psychological work that I think they intended it to do. So there's a whole
Yeah.
DMG industry, that we need to avoid reproducing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think part of, we got to this at the end of the discussion of the Sherman stuff last week. Part of it is that and Guattari is just a great example here, we're not completely bound up in our theorizing. The
Yeah.
theorizing is going into lived contexts, and coming out of them, and diverse lived contexts, and everybody is involved in different life worlds. And so that's just an important thing that that our theory might inflect our action, there isn't this deep distinction between theory and praxis, obviously, because that's another kind of quasi-ontological binary. But they are mutually informing each other to the extent that they are separate at all. And again, yeah, Guattari is with patience. He is, a very engaged political activist. We have our projects that are engaged in material realities in the world in different ways. And some of them, for me, are quite divorced from this kind of thing in a lot of ways. Although, of course, I will always return to sort of the theory of heterogenetic evolution of toxin encoding genes and toxin producing animals and all of those things as being deeply relevant to the project of mitigating the burden of the most neglected tropical disease of snakebite. So those things plug into each other, but the theorizing doesn't wholly subsume the practical element. And then on the side of the theorizing, I also think it's important that this kind of theory, in critical theory and stuff, broadly speaking, is, and of course this is nothing novel to say, but is then deeply inserted into lived realities. But I'm not now talking about just in terms of practice, like being an activist or whatever it is, but I mean, can you take these principles and apply them at some level of detail? Well, can you apply them to the detail of some, rich life world? So for me, part of this is about taking this stuff and mapping it into chemical ecology and kind of seeing what emerges from the collision of these modes of thinking with all of the very rich and complex and messy, molecular through organismal, etc., realities that I'm, engaged with through my work as a biologist, broadly speaking. And there's some resistance to that, though, in critical theory circles. One's doing this analogy, and there are those Deleuzians who think that a big part of the problem in the D&G industry is the people just analogically applying it to X, Y, and Z and forgetting that a lot of this is about psychology, human psychology, and about human implication in machinic assemblages, and about the political action that can be generated and all of that. And all of that's obviously incredibly important, but it's not just about that. It's also about the attendant ontology that applies to, is univocal. And it just has to be done well. It's not reductionist. It's not ultimately saying that, we can get, explain Deleuze and Guattari away by going into molecular biology or something like that. It's about a mutual enlightenment, mapping across these levels, and it just has to be done well, and it has to be done with a sufficient level of detail, not just this is a machinic assemblage, and this is not just a labeling of things, and it remains to be seen how well I can do that, but that's how I think the rubber hits the road on some of these things as well. Is like you get these principles, well, it's a test of their aptness, but also a test of their aptness in mapping them onto relatively well characterized, say, scientific realities, and also, of course, noting how deeply derived and dependent they are on a very deep engagement with science. Guattari are deeply engaged with system science. And then also seeing what can they illuminate. Can I learn anything about chemical ecological realities by applying this mode of thought to them? And that's another test of those things. But it's also a test of the understanding of the dominant. And of course, there are heaps of problems with the kind of dominant hegemonic biological mode of thought. So can we bring in things that are clearly already deeply related to them, and there's a genealogy obviously that we can chart there, and we have charted before, but Rouillère, Simondon, obviously the Whiteheadian influence, the Prigogine connection, these things are already networked, but yeah, what can be illuminated in that way.
It reminds me of something Donna Haraway says, in staying with the trouble that it matters what ideas we think ideas with, it matters what stories we tell stories with, and it gets back to this the role that um, abstract machines play in mediating um, our knowledge. And so, in biology, there are uh, in mainstream biology, certain concepts that I think could be helpfully um disturbed by carrying in some of these concepts that Deleuze and Guattari are creating, to unsettle things and to question, to remind scientists that they're always thinking with ideas in their attempts to represent whatever aspect of nature that they're studying. And just even the very idea of nature apart from the human is one that needs to be continually interrogated. Um, there's this great couple of lines I want to share from actually Anti-Oedipus that speaks to this, and then should probably wrap up here kind of soon, so I can eat my dinner. But they're just, they're emphasizing we make no distinction between man and nature. Um, and then they talk about industry no longer being considered from the extrinsic point of view of utility, but from the point of view of the fundamental identity with nature, of its fund of industry's fundamental identity with nature as a production of man by man. Um, and then they say, not man as king of creation, but rather as the being who is in intimate contact with the profound life of all forms or of all types of beings, who is responsible for even the stars and animal life, and who ceaselessly plugs an organ machine into an energy machine, a tree into his body, a breast into his mouth, the sun into his asshole, the eternal custodian of the machines of the universe. Um, this reminds me so much. It's like a postmodern version of the Renaissance Hermeticist Pico della Mirandola, who, in his oration on the dignity of the human, talked about uh, God creating all the other plants and animals. Each has its own sort of archetypal nature, its own instincts to tell it what its role is, and then the human just doesn't have that. We're left free of any archetypal essence, as it were, and end up having to discover our role as kind of custodians,
Mm.
as they put it there. And it's kind of a surprising statement, but speaks to the deeper, I think, hermetic
Mm.
lineage that they're still inheritors of there.
100%. And again, I think it's just a matter of scale, though, like temporal scale, in the sense that, you know, no organisms have essences.
Yeah,
In,
yeah.
in
That's just a nice story that Pico
No,
tells.
no,
He
no, for
believes
sure.
it.
But I think the important way of nuancing it is in terms of temporal scales, because
Right.
some organisms are much more stable over much longer periods of time. Like they appear to be doing exactly the same things for very, very long periods of time. And then other organisms are hyperplastic. And that may go, hand in hand with an investment in things like niche construction. But of course, the ability to traverse different niches because of a diverse behavioral repertoire, but it could be a diverse chemical repertoire for that matter as well. The capacity to reconstitute oneself rapidly. And funnily enough, some of the most stable organisms people are going to think of, like, single-celled organisms that have been around forever, if we could do the genomes of those, ancient bacteria and compare them to ones today, they would be highly different, because and especially if we were going to do the gene expression patterns, they would be highly different. And these are actually highly adaptable lineages. The basic, see, it's only at a certain level of abstraction where the organizational economy, the organization, would look static over these very, very long periods of time. If you were getting in more close to the details, you would see that they're constantly in flux, right? But also in ways that produce consistencies over intermediate timescales and things like that. But of course, we think of the human and the brain and our, the development of our brain and our cognitive capacities, and the brain as this most plastic of organs, and so our capacity to proliferate behavioral diversification on very, very short timescales, and of course the way we've plugged our identities into these discursive networks, which themselves are evolving very, very rapidly. So our identities are always drifting. Yeah, no, I fully agree that they're part of this Hermetic lineage, though. So can I quickly just read a couple of quotes as well on just to try and connect this, kind of just to go back again to what the machine is, and then really connect it to something slightly broader, just to finish again. So the essence of them, this is a quote from, I haven't actually got in my notes where I got this one from, so it could be, I don't think it's this essay. It could be 1,000 Plateaus. It could be Machine and Structure. But the essence of the machine is precisely this function of detaching a signifier as representative, as a differentiator, as a causal break, different in kind from the structurally established order of things. So it's a heterogenizer. It works by breaking down the established order. So one of the things that you often see is like, mechanisms work by working, but eventually break down. But the machinic, works by breaking down, as in it works by breaking the established order, right? And in this, it's a repetition of the particular, Guattari will say. So it's an amplification of, to your point as well, a singularizing line of flight. So it's the activity of selection, actually, when a unique confluence of events comes to pass, in which, for example, a molecule encounters a novel interaction partner and has an unprestatable effect, which benefits an organism, one or the other organism, some organism in this ecological encounter. And then there are diverse modes of selection which lead to the repetition of and the amplification of and the ultimate stabilizing of. And of course, nothing remains stable, also to a point you made right at the beginning, but nothing remains stable in evolutionary terms without a stabilizing selection, because everything is drifting and it needs to be continually corrected. But there are different modes of selection, from a behavioral mode in which an organism, goes out into its environment seeking more of that molecule, which had some, beneficial effect on it. And there are, obviously you can think of human drug seeking, but there are, umpteen zillion examples we could give. But also a feedback on gene expression, which, leads to more of that molecule being produced in the internal economy of the organism. But again, it could be an exogenously directed organism. So there are lots of different ways that kind of selection gets a foothold in the amplification of this singularizing line of flight, which is released from the established order by the machinic element. And that is the essence, as they say, of the machine here. And going all the way back to this one, definitely from machine. That one was not from Machine and Structure. That was probably 1,000 Plateaus. But this from Machine and Structure, so Guattari's 1969 essay, which he sent to Deleuze, which was in part a commentary on the way Deleuze was mobilizing Lacan and structuralism in The Logic of Sense, his 1968 book, I think, or is it 69? Anyway, about the same time, 68 or 69. It's published, pretty much alongside Difference and Repetition. It might be 69, but anyway, the same year. Then Guattari writes this essay and sends it to Deleuze, and Deleuze is obviously very struck by it. And he later said, in many ways, he felt that Guattari was ahead of him, and this, stimulated them to work together. And obviously, the rest is history. He says here, the objet petit a, described by Lacan as the root of desire, as the umbilicus of the dream. So the thing that is drawing something out in a particular direction, but it bursts into the structural equilibrium of the individual like some infernal machine. So this is the psychoanalytic image then of something, and again, this is very consonant with a Jungian image, of something erupting, something that is unpre-canalized by the prevailing, psychic economy of consciousness. And so something that is seen by the ego as radically as an alterity that erupts from the unconscious, and the umbilicus of the dream, because obviously this could be happening in a dream process, and like while you're waking up there might be some remnant of that is an umbilicus that connects you back to the logic of the dream, which is an alterity that then could restructure your conscious waking life. It's a disruptive element fundamentally, right? Erupting from the unconscious, disturbing the structural equilibrium. So he does say in Machinic Heterogenesis somewhere, this is not a thought of equilibrium. And again, cf. Autopoiesis, which is in a sense about, even though it's a far from equilibrium notion, it's about establishing equilibrium at, as it's really a non-equilibrium steady state. This is the Machinic is about bursting into that equilibrium and disrupting it. And this is just like, again, which I've said a few times without, we haven't going to have a chance to develop this whole notion of machinic pharmacoecology, which is where I'm taking this stuff, but like an exochemical, like a molecule of exogenous origin entering the economy from the outside, the physiological economy of the organism, and disrupting it and dissolving its structural equilibrium. So perturbing its attractor states, violating its autopoiesis. And then I think we've talked a little bit about the way this is actually constitutive of the organization of so many organisms, and not just at an energetic level. So again, not that the organism is organizationally closed but energetically open, but actually often obligatory organizational informing, transforming molecules are co-opted from, appropriated from other lineages in the constitution of the mature organism and its well, not so much, poietic state. But also the example that's obviously would render this quite vivid, I'm sure, for lots of listeners, is the example of psychedelics and the notion of disruptive pharmacology. So machinic pharmacoecology, this notion that I have there is this notion of disruptive pharmacology. So the way, and there's a distinction there between the disruptive pharmacon and the normative pharmacon, we won't get into that, but the way those molecules in particular come in to a physiological economy, to a neural informational economy with all of these habitually canalized networks, habitually canalized patterns of activity, which are essentially, definitional of or constitutive of the subject of the self as experienced and self-defined and autopoietic and all of that. And they come in and undo all of those connections, deterritorialize that, and enable then, because that's what the machinic assemblage of the brain is going to do. It's going to fight to reconstitute itself, and so, but by unzipping these habitual patterns, there's the possibility of novel, canalizations, novel reference frames, novel attractor states, etc., to be reconstituted from that. So just to say that the psychedelic molecule is the machinic disruptor par excellence. So thinking of the essence of the machine as this, but again, it's the whole process of production, because it's the destruction or deconstruction of the old, enabling the old abstract machine, enabling the generation, the constitution of the novel abstract machine, which again is the novel organizational form that the system is going to take after the influence of this disruptive machinic element.
It also seems to speak to Guattari's problem with the limitations of Varela's autopoietic theory, that it doesn't have an evolutionary lineage, because the only reason psilocybin or psilocybin has an effect on the mammalian nervous system is because of a prior evolutionary members of the evolutionary lineage, which established that molecular connection to 5-HT2A receptors, millions of years ago. And so that also seems, I guess they could Varela might account for that in terms of structural coupling, but it speaks to the way in which that distinction, given the profound effects that molecule has on our perception and consciousness and the way that the nervous system organizes itself, it seems like that closure can't really hold when you consider the effect of these molecules.
Yeah, I think we should be careful in both not in dismissing, but also in accepting a hypothesis which would require the coevolution of human 5-HT2A receptors and psilocybin or psilocin, which is the active molecule there. But there is a very deep evolutionary history of shared descent going back, many hundreds of millions of years between fungi and animals. And also there is even a deep physical lineage that kind of predates life in the sense that there are only certain ways that these organic molecules are forming and are stable and all of that. There's a whole and then there are intermediate levels. Life only has a particular repertoire of molecules out of all the possible ones that could be used and all of that. So there's a detailed reconstruction of that genealogy to be had, but also and closer to there being a coevolutionary history. If we imagine, and we don't know, that psilocin in its active form is there as some kind of signaling metabolite, possibly not aimed at humans or apes, but aimed at insects or whatever it might be. Like, don't eat too much of this because it becomes disorienting, and like it could be a defensive toxin. It might not be. We don't know. But again, we're of course much closer. We have a lot of the same neurotransmitter pathways as insects, etc. So it's going to have some kind of effect on us. And again, I'm not dismissing there being a much more tightly bound coevolutionary relationship, and there certainly is for the past several million years, but that could be secondary to the very strong interaction between the molecules. The coevolutionary relationship might begin because of humans, say, discovering that these mushrooms do interesting things, and then we've transported them all around the world. And even some of that remains arbitrary in the sense that, mushrooms get spores get transported everywhere in like garden mulch, or, we take bovine livestock around the world, and certain species of psilocybin are psilocybe mushrooms and other psilocybin producing fungi are in an obligatory commensal relationship with the bovines. They only grow in their poo. So there are all these different ways that these assemblages come together. Just to nuance that point,
Sure.
I suppose. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Um, I guess we should stop there. I had another thought, but I'm getting kind of hungry here. Um, I'm kind of hooked and might actually, like I
Yeah.
said, I haven't
Yeah.
tried to read this since college, and I think I'm in a better place to understand it now, all these years later, and Anti-Oedipus seems as relevant as ever, given the rise of these fascistic um, movements around the world. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to dip into Félix Guattari. I hadn't read his solo work before, so um, I he's engaging with all the ideas and thinkers that I know and love. So I'll have to
Yeah.
read the rest of this book too, Chaosmosis.
This is
Uh,
probably his simplest book in some respects, but like well worth reading, pretty quick read. But yeah, if you want to do some Anti-Oedipus together, I'm very much up for that. And obviously, A Thousand Plateaus is in a sense even closer to where, obviously temporally it's closer to where Guattari is with the machinic heterogenesis. But I mean, A Thousand Plateaus is an endlessly rich text, and there's tons of biology in there.
mm,
Um,
right, some
so
young.
yeah, Jung gets mentioned in both books.
Right.
Um, yeah, if you want to do some Anti-Oedipus, I'm absolutely on board with that. And I think is it I don't have my copy right here, but it might be chapter 4, which is it like Introduction to Schizoanalysis or something like that?
Um, Chapter 4 is Introduction to Schizoanalysis. Yeah. Hmm.
I think that might be the core of the project there.
Hmm.
So obviously, reading the whole thing is very important. But if you want to focus on that for a reading group at some point, for a reading group for a chat, I mean, there is actually a new reading group for Anti-Oedipus organized by the Acid Horizon and Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour guys.
Did they
Um,
just start it? Where, how far along are they?
it hasn't started yet.
Oh,
But they've set up a Discord for like patrons of one or other of those podcasts, and it seems like it's going to be a big thing. There's a lot of people there. I as always will not be able to really take an active part in the reading group because it'll be at some hour that is not appropriate to Australians with toddlers. But I mean, obviously, if you want to get involved in that, you should. But also, we could do our own parallel readings.
yeah. No, I think it makes sense to just for us to just do chapter four, uh,
Yeah,
which is already about 100 pages. So
yeah,
yeah,
it's
that
a big one. Yeah, probably not next week, but we should schedule it in for the not too distant future. We'll work it out. Yeah,
definitely cool. Yeah, I'd enjoy that. All right,
awesome.
Tim. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah,
Uh,
enjoy your evening.
thank you. Little holiday break here. No meetings tomorrow or Friday, so I will enjoy it.
Nice. Cool, man.
Um,